They said the alien girl had forgotten how to smile long before the storm ever found her. The rain came down in silver sheets across the Wyoming frontier, drumming against the metal roof of Ethan Walker's barn hard enough to drown out almost every sound except the wind. It was close to midnight, and the storm had already knocked out power across 3 neighboring ranches. Lightning flashed beyond the hills, turning the open fields white for a heartbeat before plunging everything back into darkness. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and stepped onto the porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. His border collie, Rusty, stood beside him with ears raised toward the distant pasture. Something felt different tonight. The air carried that strange stillness that sometimes followed the worst part of a storm, when the world seemed to be holding its breath. Then Rusty barked. Once. Sharp. Alert. Ethan frowned. The dog rarely barked without reason. Another flash of lightning illuminated the fence line nearly 100 yards away. For the briefest moment, Ethan thought he saw a figure. Small. Motionless. He set down the mug and grabbed a flashlight. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the yard. Rain soaked through his sleeves within seconds. Rusty stayed close, weaving through puddles as they approached the fence. The flashlight beams swept across broken grass, scattered branches, and finally stopped. A young woman lay curled against a fence post. Not human. Even beneath the rain, her skin carried a deep sapphire blue color unlike anything found on Earth. Silver-white hair clung to her face in wet strands. One thin arm was wrapped around herself as if she were trying to disappear. Ethan slowed. Over the years, he had seen travelers from dozens of worlds pass through the frontier settlements. Freight crews, researchers, refugees, drifters. But something about this girl felt different. She wasn't unconscious. Her eyes were open. Large violet eyes stared past him into the darkness as though she didn't even notice he was there. Hey, Ethan called gently. Can you hear me? No response. The rain continued falling between them. He stepped closer. You're going to freeze out here. Still nothing. Most people would have looked afraid. Angry. Relieved. This girl looked empty. Like someone who had spent too long carrying something too heavy to put down. Rusty approached first. The border collie sniffed cautiously before sitting beside her without a sound. The girl blinked once. That was the only reaction Ethan saw. Lightning flashed again. For a split second, he noticed a faded identification band around her wrist. Refugee, transport registration. Old. Worn nearly smooth. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen those bands before. They belonged to people who had lost more than homes. All right, he said quietly. You can stay out here if you want. But I'm heading back to the house, and I'm bringing you with me. The girl never answered. She simply stared into the storm as rain streamed down her face. Ethan removed his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. For the first time, her eyes shifted. Not to him. Not to the house. To the jacket itself. Just for a second. Then the expression vanished. Somewhere beyond the dark hills, thunder rolled across the prairie. Ethan had no way of knowing it yet, but that silent girl beside the fence would change the meaning of kindness on his ranch forever. By the time Ethan guided the old pickup truck into the barn, the storm had begun to drift east across the prairie. Rain still tapped against the metal roof, but the violent wind was fading into a distant howl. Rusty jumped down first and shook water across the concrete floor. The girl remained motionless in the passenger seat. Ethan opened the door and waited. For a moment he wondered if she would refuse. Instead, she slowly stepped out on her own. Mud stained the bottom of her clothes. Rainwater dripped from strands of silver hair. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her expression. Not fear. Not distrust. More like someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world a long time ago. Ethan led her toward the house. Warm yellow light glowed through the kitchen windows. The old farmhouse was nothing special. Weathered wood. A creaking porch. A chimney that complained every winter. But it was dry. And tonight that was enough. Inside, the smell of coffee and cedar filled the air. The fireplace crackled softly in the living room. The girl paused near the doorway. Her violet eyes moved across the room as if studying a place she could not quite understand. Ethan grabbed a clean towel from a cabinet and placed it on the kitchen table. You can use that if you want. No response. He pointed toward the hallway. Bathroom is down there. Hot water still works most days. That is about the nicest thing I can say about this house. Silence. Ethan sighed quietly. He was not much of a talker himself, but this felt different. Most people eventually answered something. She simply stood there. Rusty wandered over and rested his head against her leg. The girl looked down. Her hand hesitated before lightly touching the dog behind one ear. Rusty immediately sat beside her as if they had known each other for years. Ethan noticed but said nothing. Instead, he opened the refrigerator and pulled out a container of beef stew left from the previous night. 20 minutes later, a bowl sat steaming on the table. The girl remained standing near the doorway. "You do not have to talk," Ethan said. "You do not have to explain anything tonight." He pushed the bowl slightly closer to the empty chair. "But you probably should eat." Then he walked away. Not far. Just enough. He busied himself repairing a loose cabinet hinge while pretending not to watch. Nearly 5 minutes passed. Finally, the chair moved. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the ticking kitchen clock. Ethan glanced up. The girl had taken a seat. She held the spoon carefully, as though she had forgotten how ordinary things worked. Steam rose between her and the bowl. She ate slowly, one bite at a time. No hurry, no expression, but she kept eating. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly across the distant hills. Inside, the house felt warmer. Later, Ethan spread clean blankets across the spare bedroom. The room had once belonged to visiting relatives. Now it mostly stored forgotten boxes and old memories. He left a lamp glowing beside the bed and turned toward the door. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow can worry about itself." The girl sat quietly on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes drifted toward the window where rain still traced silver lines down the glass. Ethan waited for a response that never came. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard only one sound behind him. Not words, not a sigh, just the faint rustle of someone pulling a blanket closer for the first time in a very long while. Morning arrived wrapped in pale gold sunlight and the lingering smell of rain-soaked earth. Ethan woke before dawn as he always did. The ranch did not care whether someone had slept well. Animals needed feeding. Fences needed checking. Life moved forward one task at a time. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. Water still clung to the grass in sparkling droplets. The storm had left behind a sky so clear it almost looked new. Rusty bounded across the yard ahead of him, chasing shadows and possibilities. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then Ethan remembered the quiet guests sleeping down the hall. The kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh coffee by the time sunlight spilled through the windows. He placed a second mug on the counter out of habit before realizing she probably would not drink it. Still, he left it there. The spare bedroom door remained closed until nearly 8 o'clock. When it finally opened, the girl stepped into the hallway wearing one of his old flannel shirts. The sleeves hung past her hands. Her silver hair was dry now, falling neatly across her shoulders. For the first time, she looked less like someone rescued from a storm and more like a young woman who had simply wandered too far from home. Ethan gave a small nod. "Morning." She did not answer. He had expected that. He pointed toward the kitchen table where a plate of scrambled eggs and toast waited. "Help yourself." The girl paused before sitting down. She ate quietly, slowly, the same careful movements as the night before, as if every action required thought. Ethan occupied himself fixing a broken lantern on the counter. He had learned long ago that silence felt less threatening when someone was not staring at you. The radio murmured softly from a shelf nearby. Local weather updates. Farm. Reports. Ordinary sounds. Halfway through breakfast, a voice from the radio mentioned a refugee processing center nearly 80 miles away reopening after storm damage. The spoon stopped moving. Just for a second. Ethan noticed. So did Rusty. The dog lifted his head from beneath the table. Then the moment passed. The spoon continued. The silence returned. Later that morning, Ethan drove into town for feed supplies. The local general store sat beside a gas station and a diner that somehow survived every economic downer known to mankind. While loading bags into the truck bed, he mentioned finding a young refugee during the storm. The store owner, Martha Jenkins, immediately knew who he meant. "Blue skin? White hair?" she asked. Ethan nodded. Martha's expression softened. "Her name is Lyra." Ethan froze. It was the first thing he had learned about her. Martha leaned against the counter. "A transport convoy came through here almost 3 years ago. She was with her family." Her voice grew quieter. "Only she made it to the settlement." Ethan looked toward the dusty front window. Martha continued. "People tried helping. Counselors. Volunteers. Refugee workers. She never caused trouble. Never complained. Never smiled either." The words settled heavily between them. On the drive home, Ethan found himself glancing at the empty passenger seat. Lyra. The name seemed strange and delicate at the same time. Back at the ranch, he found her sitting on the porch steps. Rusty rested beside her. The dog looked perfectly content. Lyra stared across the endless prairie stretching toward the horizon. Ethan carried the feed sacks toward the barn, then stopped halfway. For a moment, sunlight caught her face. Not happiness, not peace, just sadness worn so long it had become familiar. And somehow that felt far heavier than the storm itself. The days settled into a quiet rhythm after that. Morning sunlight spilled across the ranch. Wind rolled through the tall grass like waves across a green ocean. The world moved exactly as it always had. Yet somehow the farmhouse felt different. Not louder, not happier, just less empty. Lyra remained silent. She spoke no words at breakfast. None. During dinner. None while sitting on the porch as evening painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ethan never pushed. He had seen enough hurt in people to understand one simple truth. Some wounds healed better when left alone. Instead of questions, he offered ordinary things. A fresh cup of tea beside her chair. A warm blanket when temperatures dropped after sunset. A seat at the table whether she used it or not. Little things. The kind most people stop noticing. Yet Lyra seemed to notice all of them. One afternoon, Ethan repaired a section of fencing along the northern pasture. The work was slow. Bent wire. Loose posts. Endless little problems that ranches seem to create overnight. He looked up once and saw Lyra standing nearly 50 yards away. Watching. Not helping. Not hiding either. Simply observing. The next morning, a small pile of replacement fence staples sat neatly beside his toolbox. Ethan never saw who put them there. He did not need to ask. Another day, he returned from the barn to find Rusty's water bowl freshly cleaned and filled. The dog seemed pleased with the arrangement. Lyra never mentioned it. Neither did Ethan. Their conversations existed almost entirely through actions. Somehow that seemed enough. The ranch itself appeared determined to include her whether she wanted it or not. Chickens wandered into her path. Barn cats claimed spots beside her on the porch. Rusty followed her from room to room whenever Ethan was busy elsewhere. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to greet her with its familiar hourly chime. Life surrounded her from every direction. She rarely reacted, but she no longer looked quite as distant as before. One evening, Ethan found her standing inside the barn just before sunset. Dust floated through beams of golden light streaming between wooden boards. The horses shifted quietly in their stalls. Lyra stood beside Daisy, an aging golden retriever stretched comfortably across a pile of blankets. Daisy had lived on the ranch for nearly 11 years. She moved slower these days. Her muzzle had turned almost completely white, yet her tail still wagged whenever someone entered the barn, especially Lyra. The old dog rested her head against the girl's knee. Lyra's hand moved gently across the dog's fur. Slow, careful. Ethan noticed something then. It was the longest he had ever seen her focus on anything. Not the horizon, not her memories. Something real, something present. Daisy let out a sleepy sigh. Lyra looked down immediately as if concerned. Ethan smiled to himself. She likes you, he said quietly. Lyra remained silent, but she did not move away. Over the next few days, Daisy stayed close to her. Wherever Lyra sat, the old dog eventually appeared nearby, sometimes sleeping, sometimes watching the world with tired brown eyes. One afternoon, Ethan carried a bag of feed into the barn and stopped short. Lyra sat cross-legged beside Daisy with a brush in her hand. She was carefully grooming the old dog's fur. The movements were awkward at first, as though she was unfamiliar with the task. Yet Daisy looked perfectly content. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched for a moment before returning to work. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass. Inside, the barn felt warmer somehow. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Lyra seemed connected to something beyond her own sorrow. She still did not smile, but she was beginning to care. And sometimes caring was the first step back toward living. Autumn settled across the Wyoming prairie one cool morning when Ethan noticed Daisy moving more slowly than usual. The old golden retriever still followed him everywhere, but there was a carefulness to her steps now, a quiet heaviness. She spent more time resting beneath the barn windows where warm sunlight pooled across the floorboards. Rusty seemed to sense it too. He stayed close to her, rarely wandering far from her side. Lyra noticed before anyone said a word. She appeared in the barn earlier each day, often carrying fresh water or an extra blanket. She never spoke, yet Daisy seemed to understand every gesture. One afternoon, Ethan knelt beside the old dog while she rested on her favorite pile of blankets. He gently rubbed behind her ears. Daisy responded with a tired wag of her tail. Then he looked up at Lyra standing nearby. I think she is getting ready, he said softly. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Ethan smiled. Not leaving. Nothing like that. He glanced back toward Daisy. She is going to have puppies. For the first time, Lyra showed something close to surprise. Her violet eyes shifted immediately toward Daisy's rounded belly. Ethan chuckled quietly. Yeah, I was surprised too. Over the next week, the ranch seemed to revolve around anticipation. Ethan converted an empty corner of the barn into a comfortable nesting area. Fresh straw, clean blankets, extra heating lamps for the cool nights ahead. Daisy supervised the preparations with the seriousness of a seasoned foreman. Lyra watched everything. Every nail hammered into place. Every blanket unfolded. Every adjustment Ethan made. She remained silent, but her attention never wandered. One evening the temperature dropped into the low 40s. Wind brushed gently against the barn walls while stars filled the sky outside. Ethan sat on an overturned feed bucket repairing a saddle strap. Lyra sat nearby brushing Daisy's fur. The old dog rested with her head in the girl's lap. The barn was quiet except for the occasional rustle of hay and the distant chirping of crickets. For nearly an hour neither of them spoke. Then something happened. Daisy shifted uncomfortably and let out a small whine. Lyra looked down immediately. Concern flashed across her face. She carefully checked the dog's blanket, smoothed the fur along her back, whispered something so softly Ethan could not hear it. It was the first time he had ever heard her voice. Not enough to understand the words, just enough to know they existed. Ethan did not react. He pretended to focus on the saddle strap. But inside, something stirred. Later that night, after Lyra had gone inside, Ethan found himself standing alone beside Daisy's sleeping area. The old dog snored softly beneath the heat lamp. He smiled and shook his head. You know something I do not, don't you, girl? Daisy's tail thumped once against the blanket without opening her eyes. The next morning brought frost glittering across the grass. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying his coffee and stopped. Lyra was already outside. She sat on the top step with Rusty beside her. In her hands rested a worn notebook Ethan had left on a shelf weeks ago. It remained closed. She was not reading it, simply holding it, watching the sunrise spread across the horizon. The cold air painted her breath silver. For a brief moment, she looked less like someone hiding from the world and more like someone slowly returning to it. Behind them, inside the barn, Daisy rested quietly beneath the warm lights. And though none of them knew exactly when it would happen, something new was coming to the ranch. Something small, something fragile, something that would soon change far more than any of them expected. The first snowfall arrived 3 nights later. It was not a heavy storm, just a thin blanket of white spreading across the prairie beneath a sky the color of steel. By evening, the ranch seemed wrapped in silence. Snow softened every sound. The fences disappeared beneath pale drifts. Even the wind moved more gently across the fields. Ethan finished securing the barn doors just after sunset when he noticed Daisy pacing inside her nesting area. The old golden retriever moved in slow circles across the blankets. Her ears twitched. Her tail wagged uncertainly. Ethan immediately recognized the signs. Looks like tonight is the night, girl, he said softly. Daisy responded with a low, content sound before settling back onto the blankets. The heat lamps cast a warm golden glow across the corner of the barn. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows. Ethan checked fresh water, adjusted the blankets, and made sure everything was ready. When he turned around, Lyra was standing in the doorway. He had not heard her arrive. Silver hair framed her face. The oversized flannel shirt still hung loosely around her shoulders. Her violet eyes were fixed entirely on Daisy. Ethan smiled. You can stay if you want. As usual, she said nothing. But she walked closer. Hours passed. The barn remained warm despite the cold gathering outside. The scent of hay mixed with cedar from the wooden beams overhead. Rusty slept nearby, occasionally lifting his head before drifting back to sleep. Lyra sat beside Daisy the entire time. She barely moved. Sometimes she adjusted a blanket. Sometimes she offered fresh water. Mostly she simply stayed. Ethan watched without commenting. There was something remarkable about the scene. A few weeks ago, Lyra had seemed disconnected from everything around her. Now she spent an entire evening focused on the comfort of an aging dog. The change was small, yet somehow it felt enormous. Near midnight, the first puppy arrived. Tiny, wet, fragile. Daisy immediately began caring for it with patient determination. Lyra leaned forward slightly. Her eyes widened. A second puppy followed not long afterward. Then a third. The hours slipped by quietly. New life entered the world one small heartbeat at a time. Ethan brought extra towels, refilled water bowls, checked temperatures. Simple tasks, familiar tasks. Yet the atmosphere inside the barn felt almost sacred. By 2 in the morning, 5 healthy puppies rested beside their mother. Small bundles of golden fur sleeping against each other beneath the heat lamps. Ethan stretched his tired back and smiled. Looks like everybody is doing just fine. Then he noticed one more puppy, smaller than the others. Much smaller. The little one lay slightly apart from the group, breathing steadily but weakly. Daisy nudged it gently toward the warmth. The puppy tried to crawl forward but struggled. Ethan frowned. Come on, little guy. He carefully wrapped the puppy in a soft towel and checked its temperature. Nothing alarming, just weaker than its brothers and sisters. Beside him, Lyra had gone completely still. Her attention never left the tiny animal. Ethan placed the puppy close to the heat lamp before returning it near Daisy. The little creature let out a faint sound and curled against its siblings. Lyra remained watching. Minutes passed, then more. Ethan eventually noticed she had not looked away once. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the barn walls. Inside, 6 newborn puppies slept beside their exhausted mother. Yet Lyra's eyes remained fixed on the smallest one, as if she understood something about fragile beginnings, as if she recognized a struggle nobody else could see. And long after Ethan finally went inside to grab fresh coffee, she stayed there alone beneath the golden light, quietly keeping watch over the smallest life in the barn. 3 days passed after the puppies were born. Snow remained scattered across the prairie in patches of white, but warmer sunlight had begun reclaiming the ranch one field at a time. Inside the barn, life revolved around 6 tiny bundles of fur. Every morning Ethan checked on them before breakfast. Every evening he checked again before bed. Daisy accepted her responsibilities with patient determination, while Rusty appointed himself unofficial guardian of the entire family. Yet one puppy drew more attention than all the others combined. The smallest one. While the others seemed to grow stronger every day, this little pup still lagged behind. Not sick, not struggling, just smaller, slower, more fragile. Ethan often found Lyra sitting beside the nesting area watching it sleep. Sometimes she held a warm blanket over her lap while the puppy rested there beneath supervision. Sometimes she simply sat nearby, studying every movement as though it mattered. One cold afternoon, Ethan entered the barn carrying fresh feed and stopped when he noticed something unusual. Lyra was speaking. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Soft words flowed from her lips in a language he did not recognize. The little puppy lay curled against her hands while she spoke. Ethan remained silent. He did not want to interrupt. He could not understand the words, but the tone carried something unmistakable. Tenderness. The kind reserved for things people are afraid to lose. He quietly finished his chores and left her alone. That evening, as darkness settled across the ranch, Ethan sat at the kitchen table sorting receipts while snowmelt dripped steadily from the porch roof outside. Lyra sat across from him. The puppy slept inside a small basket lined with blankets beside her chair. The room felt peaceful, almost ordinary. Ethan glanced at the puppy and smiled. You know, we should probably start thinking about names. No response. He expected none. Rusty got his name because of the color of his ears. The border collie lifted his head proudly from beside the fireplace. Daisy was named by my grandmother. The old golden retriever wagged her tail from her blanket near the stove. Ethan looked toward the basket. The tiny puppy slept through the discussion entirely. This little guy deserves a name too. Lyra lowered her eyes toward the basket. Her fingers rested lightly against the blanket. Ethan studied her for a moment. Then a thought crossed his mind. Simple, ordinary, yet somehow important. He leaned back in his chair. You should name him. The room became completely still. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. Lyra looked up immediately. For the first time, surprise appeared openly on her face. Not confusion. Surprise. Ethan shrugged. You spend more time with him than anybody. Silence. Seems fair to me. Lyra stared at him as though she had misunderstood. Ethan simply returned to sorting receipts. He did not repeat himself. He did not explain. Several minutes passed. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. Inside, warmth from the stove filled the room. Finally, Ethan noticed movement. Lyra had lowered her gaze toward the sleeping puppy once more. But something had changed. Her expression no longer seemed distant. Instead, she looked thoughtful, vulnerable, as though she had been handed something far more valuable than a simple choice. Much later that night, Ethan walked through the hallway toward his room. As he passed the living room doorway, he paused. Lyra sat alone beside the basket. Moonlight spilled through the window and painted silver highlights across her hair. The puppy slept peacefully beneath the blankets. Lyra reached down and gently touched one tiny paw. Then she whispered a single word. Ethan could not hear it clearly, but whatever she had said brought tears into her eyes. Not tears of grief. Something quieter. Something older. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, it seemed as though a door buried deep inside her heart had begun to open. The next morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight spilled across fresh snow and turned the entire ranch into a field of diamonds. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee and found Lyra already outside. She sat in the same chair she often chose each morning, the small puppy curled inside a blanket on her lap. The little dog had grown stronger over the past few days. Its eyes were finally open. Curious dark eyes that seemed determined to inspect every corner of the universe. Ethan leaned against the porch railing and watched them quietly. The puppy stretched, yawned, and immediately attempted to climb out of the blanket. Lyra caught it gently before it could tumble onto the wooden boards. For a brief second, the corner of her mouth almost moved. Almost. Later that afternoon, the temperature climbed enough to melt patches of snow across the yard. Water dripped steadily from the barn roof. Chickens wandered through muddy paths searching for grain. Rusty chased shadows while Daisy supervised her growing family from a comfortable nest of blankets. The smallest puppy had become surprisingly adventurous. It wandered farther than the others, stumbling across the barn floor on oversized paws. Lyra followed every movement with careful attention. Ethan carried a bucket of feed toward the stalls when the puppy suddenly tripped over a loose piece of straw. The little dog rolled sideways, blinked twice, then attempted the exact same route again. Ethan laughed. Rusty barked once as if offering encouragement. To Ethan's surprise, a soft sound followed. He turned immediately. Lyra had covered her mouth with one hand. Her shoulders trembled slightly. For a moment, he wondered if she was crying. Then he realized she was trying not to laugh. The discovery stopped him cold. The puppy continued its determined journey, completely unaware of its audience. It reached Lyra's boots and immediately began chewing on one of the laces. Another small sound escaped her. Lighter this time. Warmer. Ethan pretended not to notice. Some moments were too fragile to touch. That evening they sat together at the kitchen table while snowmelt tapped softly against the windows. The puppy slept inside a basket between them. Rusty occupied his usual position near the fireplace. Daisy rested nearby with the calm satisfaction of a mother whose family was finally thriving. Ethan glanced toward the basket. I think your friend is waiting for a name. Lyra looked down. Silence settled over the room. Then something remarkable happened. She spoke. Her voice was quiet from lack of use, yet clear enough to fill the kitchen. Hope. Ethan looked up. For a moment he simply stared. It was the first word she had spoken directly to him since arriving at the ranch. Lyra swallowed softly. Her eyes remained fixed on the sleeping puppy. My mother used to say it. The room became still. Ethan said nothing. He understood that some stories arrived one sentence at a time. Whenever things became difficult, Lyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She always said hope is the last thing the storm can take. Tears shimmered in her violet eyes, but this time they carried something different. Not grief alone. Memory. Love. Ethan nodded slowly. Hope, he repeated. That sounds perfect. The puppy stirred inside the basket as if approving the decision. Then, without warning, it climbed clumsily over the blanket and licked Lyra's hand. For one beautiful second, every wall she had built around herself seemed to disappear. A smile appeared. Small, gentle, real. Ethan had never seen it before. Neither had anyone else on that ranch. Yet somehow it transformed the entire room. Outside, the last traces of winter sunlight faded beyond the horizon. Inside, a little puppy named Hope slept peacefully between two people whose lives had quietly changed forever. Spring arrived slowly on the Wyoming prairie. Snow disappeared from the hills. Grass returned to the fields in waves of green. Morning sunlight lingered a little longer each day, and the ranch seemed to wake from a long sleep. The puppies grew quickly. What had once fit inside a single basket now raced across the yard in every direction at once. Hope remained the smallest of the litter, but nobody would have guessed it from his determination. He chased Rusty through the grass, barked at chickens twice his size, and greeted every sunrise as though it were a personal invitation to adventure. Ethan often joked that the little dog had inherited enough courage for 3 puppies. Lyra laughed every time he said it. Not the cautious smile from that evening in the kitchen. Hey, real laugh now. Soft and bright and impossible to miss. The sound had become one of Ethan's favorite parts of the day. Some mornings he would hear it drifting from the barn before breakfast. Other times it would carry across the porch while Hope invented new ways to get himself into trouble. The ranch felt different because of it. Warmer, lighter, more alive. One Saturday afternoon, Martha Jenkins stopped by with supplies from town. She climbed out of her truck, took one look across the yard, and froze. Hope was running circles around Lyra's boots while she laughed openly beneath the spring sun. Martha stared for several seconds before quietly removing her glasses. Well, I will be. Ethan looked up from repairing a gate hinge. What? Martha pointed toward the yard. That girl is smiling. Ethan followed her gaze. Lyra knelt in the grass, while Hope attempted to climb into her lap. The puppy failed repeatedly. Neither seemed bothered by it. Martha shook her head slowly. 3 years. Ethan frowned. What about 3 years? Nobody has seen her smile in 3 years. The words settled quietly between them. Ethan looked back toward the yard. He had become so accustomed to seeing Lyra change that he had forgotten how impossible it once seemed. Martha smiled softly. Whatever happened here, keep doing it. Then she carried her supplies toward the house. Evening arrived wrapped in golden light. The sky stretched endlessly above the prairie, painted in shades of orange and violet. Ethan sat on the porch steps while Rusty slept beside him. Across the yard, Hope chased butterflies through tall grass with complete confidence and very little success. Lyra sat nearby watching him. The wind moved gently through her silver hair. Peace had settled into her expression where sadness once lived. Not because the past had disappeared. It had not. Some losses remained forever. Some memories always would. But they no longer owned every part of her. After a while, Hope finally collapsed beside her, exhausted from a hard day of important puppy business. Lyra lifted him into her lap. The little dog immediately fell asleep. Ethan smiled. Looks like he had a busy schedule today. Lyra laughed quietly. Then she looked toward the horizon where the sun touched the distant hills. My mother was right, she said. Ethan glanced over. Her voice carried no pain this time, only gratitude. About Hope, he asked. She nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The prairie stretched endlessly before them. Wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Lyra gently stroked the sleeping puppy's fur. The storm could not take everything. Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon, then toward the little dog asleep in her arms, finally toward the smile still resting on her face. And in that quiet moment, he understood something simple. He had never rescued her with grand words. He had never healed her with impossible answers. Sometimes all a broken heart needed was a place to belong, a reason to care again, and one small life worth loving. The stars began appearing above the ranch one by one, their light reflected in Lyra's eyes. And for the first time in years, when she looked toward tomorrow, she smiled first.